in this period. Well, all these people were arguing, gee, Confucianism is pretty good after all. There were others who were saying, no way. In China, in Japan, and in Korea, there were all vigorous leftist movements at this time. And they were very hostile to the revivals of Confucianism. Confucianism is an old feudal form of thought. It's oppressive. It serves the interests of the landlords, and it is bad for the peasants and bad for the working people. There were other people. There were people like Maruyama Masao in Japan, a very famous thinker, and one who wrote a very influential book on Tokugawa Confucianism. Maruyama looked at Confucianism with a slightly different eye than Inoue or others. And he said, what we really can find in Confucianism is something that was leading us towards Western-style thought. And so we have the beginnings of Western-style modernity in Japan in Confucianism. And he said, now it's time to transcend that and attain a more Western liberal democracy in Japan. Unfortunately, he was not able to voice those opinions very loudly during the 1930s and 1940s because of the militaristic fascist regime in Japan. So he was not able to really make his points until after 1945. In China, you had thinkers like Hu Shi, who were very much interested in Western-style liberal thought and traveled around, taught in Chinese universities. In Korea, of course, you had people like Lee Kwang-soo. Lee Kwang-soo is a very interesting character. He's famous mostly for being Korea's first modern novelist, but he was a very important thinker during the colonial period. And Lee Kwang-soo penned a rather lengthy treatise called Minjo Kejoron, or On Remaking the Nation. And Lee Kwang-soo's argument was basically the reason why we in Korea have been colonized by Japan, as it turns out, is because of deficiencies in our national character. And what are these deficiencies in our national character? They are Slavish deference to authority, they are lack of creativity, they are factionalism, they are unwillingness to work with one's hands. And Lee Kwang-soo said all of these problems come from Confucianism. So we need to reject Confucianism in order to rebuild our national character so that we, at some future point, will be ready to be an independent nation once again. Lee Kwang-soo was later pilloried for being a pro-Japanese supporter in Korea. And in fact, much of his argument on remaking the nation echoed the kind of arguments that Japanese apologists were making to legitimize their colonization of Korea. But nonetheless, he was there making those kinds of arguments. This period of the decline of the West sort of came to a halt with World War II and with the American victory over Japan and with the rise of the Cold War regime in the late 1940s into the 1950s. In Japan, in China, and in Korea, the general climate was Confucianism has been bad. There were exceptions to that, but generally the decline of the West and the revival of Confucianism was a dead letter by this point. However, as we get into the age of globalization, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, again things changed. People looked at the remarkable economic development of East Asian countries, not only Japan, but also South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and they looked at the attainment of democracy in Japan, of course, first, and then in South Korea and in Taiwan. And they said, wow, these countries of East Asia are doing something that countries in the Middle East and Africa and other parts of the world have not been able to do. They've industrialized, they've become economically wealthy, now they are starting to become democracies. And what do all of these countries share? They're all part of the Confucian cultural sphere. Yes. And so we began to get people advancing arguments to explain this. One of the first was an American a scholar named Theodore de Bary, who taught at Columbia University. And de Bary is a very sophisticated scholar. And he was one of the first American scholars to say, hey, there's something good in Confucianism. And he began to argue that within Neo-Confucianism, there was a kind of rationalism that was very similar to the rationalism that we think that we see in early modern Western thought. And he put forth a kind of dialectic of transformations of Confucian thought, which he said is very similar to what happened in the West, and which was leading East Asia towards a kind of Westernizing or modernizing transformation before the forces of Western imperialism interrupted. Well, of course, this period saw revivals of Confucianism throughout East Asia. Japan started in the 1980s. And of course, the 1980s was a time when Japan was really riding high, selling all kinds of cars and TVs and whatnot to the rest of the world and becoming very wealthy. And everybody was saying Japan is in the driver's seat. You know, that Japan is going to be the world's #1 economy soon. And the Japanese, they became very confident. And the Japanese and the rest of the world were paying much attention to the Japanese management style. And people were beginning to argue, well, there are important Confucian elements in the Japanese management style. So you get scholars like Shimada Kinji who say the combination of Confucianism and capitalism produces unprecedented growth in Japan, and surely it can do it everywhere else. Okay. What about in China? And here I'm going to speak more broadly. I'm going to speak about what I would call the Sinophone world. So this includes not only mainland China, but includes Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. You had the New Confucians, people led by Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, but also scholars in places like Hong Kong and Taiwan and elsewhere, who were saying it's our Asian values, our Confucian values, that have allowed us to develop ourselves economically and have also allowed us to produce very harmonious societies. And Lee Kuan Yew was very proud of what he had achieved in Singapore. And these people begin to argue against Western notions of civil rights and human rights and say, no, that's not what we need. We need Confucian emphasis on harmony. Of course, the People's Republic of China was hardly thinking along those lines during those years. But I think, as you're all aware, in recent years, the PRC, mainland China, has become much more interested in Confucianism once again. Probably for a variety of reasons, including Confucianism as a means of social and political control. And we're now